We're honored to have two prominent executives of the South African horse racing industry here with us this afternoon. First, I'd like to introduce Arnold Hyde, Racing Control Executive of the National Horse Racing Authority of Southern Africa. Arnold has been an employee of the National Horse Racing Authority of Southern Africa since 1998 and has worked as a stipendiary steward in the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Western Cape, and Central Provinces. Arnold was appointed as the Racing Control Executive in 2015 and is based in Johannesburg. He is a member of the IFHA's International Harmonization of Race Day Rules Committee and co-chaired Monday's International Stewards Conference here in Cape Town. In addition, following Arnold will be Hazel Kayiya, Racing Admin Executive in the Studbook Department for the National Horse Racing Authority of Southern Africa. Hazel joined the NHA in 2018 as their Racing Administration Executive, and she manages a portfolio that includes the Studbook, Information Services, Registration, and Licensing departments. Prior to this, Hazel worked at the Hong Kong Jockey Club as manager of Racing Authority External, and among her other duties, Hazel undertook the secretariat function for the Asian Racing Federation. And prior to joining the HKJC, she was employed by Gold Circle and has held several positions, including Corporate Services Executive and Risk Assurance Audit Manager. She's also a member of the Institute of International Auditors of South Africa, Institute Risk Management South Africa, and Southern African Institute of Professional Accountants, and is the representative for Southern Africa and Zimbabwe at the ISBC and European and African Studbook Committee. So I'd like to ask Arnold to come to the stage. Thank you, Arnold.
Thank you, Andrew, for those kind words. It's an absolute honor to be present here today and have the opportunity to deliver this presentation with Hazel Kayiya. This is a subject that is particularly close to my heart, and I do repeat the words on a very regular basis that we need to look after the horse because the horse doesn't have a voice. And obviously those are words, and we are very much at the stage in South Africa where we need to ensure that we walk the walk now and we don't just talk the talk. If I could just give a brief overview of the South African landscape and our racing in this country. As Andrew stated, I work for the National Horse Racing Authority. We are in control of the regulation of the sport in this country. We are tasked with providing an atmosphere and an environment where the sport can thrive, and of course there are a number of stakeholders and role players within the industry that rely on strict governance, regulation, and of course integrity. Of course it all comes down to the horse, and that's the subject of this meeting today. We race in Western Cape, Cape Town, where we are presently, Kenilworth and Durbanville race courses, in the Eastern Cape and Port Elizabeth, about 800 kilometers away. KwaZulu-Natal, it's another 800 meters up the coast away from Port Elizabeth, on the Haarveld in Johannesburg, and there's a minor centre in the Northern Cape, Flamingo Park racecourse in Kimberley, which is a sand surface, and as a minor racing centre rather on the sand surface, this is where a lot of the horses that aren't performing end up. We then have racing in Zimbabwe, our northern neighbour, that also falls under our control. Our values are to look after the stakeholders and of course the horse. And I must pay homage to the National Horse Trust as an umbrella body that is a trust that has been set up to look after the care of not only racehorses but all the equine disciplines in South Africa. And in Cape Town we have the Western Cape Horse Trust, the Eastern Cape Horse Unit, and the coastal units in KwaZulu-Natal, the Haarveld Horse Care Unit in Johannesburg. The National Horse Trust is the main umbrella body that is based in Johannesburg. There's statistics on the next slide. You'll see that I've provided 3 years statistics. And you will see from that the foal crop in South Africa is declining. It is a problem that a number of jurisdictions face. And we need to look seriously at that full crop, the number of horses that we have coming through the system, and of course our program and our fixture list, because we need to put on a set number of races for our local and international product. And perhaps we need to seriously consider if our program is assisting the whole environment of horse racing in the country relating to the welfare of horses, and if perhaps we could prolong the racing career of horses in this country. You will see the statistics below that for 3 years as well, where you'll see a second career, which I will get to later on, and then the numbers of horses that have been retired from racing over the 3-year period, and the number of horses retired from breeding, and of course there's a total at the end. Now, as Elliot stated earlier, South Africa did define what a retired horse is, and we included it in our rule book under Rule 41.12. And I will get to Rule 41 in its completeness, but I think it's important to state that we have defined what a retired horse is. And a horse will be regarded as having been retired from the time it leaves a trainer's yard or a breeding establishment to be placed in the care of a person who is not registered with the National Horse Racing Authority. Our rules define a person who is under our rules, and when we define a retired horse, we add that a horse is no longer in racing and won't be registered and is retired if it goes to a person outside of our definition of a licensed or registered person. In 2017, we saw there was a need to tighten up on horses retiring from racing and to keep the traceability aspect intact regarding the whereabouts of where these horses end up, because we're all aware, and it's been stated before in previous presentations, that there is the risk and potential damage to the industry if one case ends up in the media. And of course, we all hear of the bad stories. The press like to latch onto these issues and these stories, which make good news. But of course, we're very serious about the welfare of the horse. We need to ensure that the aftercare is taking care of once horses end their racing career. And we thought long and hard about how we could take this step forward to ensure that we tighten up on this aspect. Now, I wish I could stand up here today and say that we have all the answers. Unfortunately, I can't. I've heard the challenges from other presentations. I was very interested to hear that these challenges have been closely addressed for decades. We are in the early stages of looking at this problem that we are faced with. And it's not a Southern Africa problem. It's a universal problem. So I'm not going to paint a pretty picture of what we've done to ensure perfect aftercare scenario, because we aren't in that space. And I certainly need to admit at the get-go that we consider it very important that we do get in line with what we can do and what we can do to ensure that we improve on the work that we are currently doing, because there's a lot of room for improvement, to be frank. We introduced Rule 41.10, which was a major advancement in this line to try and tighten up on traceability and to ensure that horses end up in decent homes and are afforded the necessary respect that these wonderful animals need and demand. 41.10 states, the owner of a horse shall remain responsible for the care and welfare of a horse registered in his name with the National Horse Racing Authority once it retires from racing, and for the rest of its natural life, unless he transfers ownership of the horse to another owner or an owner in another racing jurisdiction. And I've already explained the various provinces that we have in this country. Or he can transfer ownership of the horse to a breeder, or transfers ownership of a horse to a horse care unit around the country, run under the auspices of the National Horse Trust, or another rehoming facility approved by the Chief Executive, together with the required fee. So we provided them with those options following retirement of a horse. That the horse is humanely euthanized, and that this euthanasia is reported to the National Horse Racing Authority. and disposes of, whether by public auction or otherwise, the horse out of racing on condition that a second career assessment form, as prescribed from time to time, has been completed by a veterinary surgeon, the owner and the trainer, enabling the horse to pursue an intended second career outside of horse racing. If required, the owner agrees to make all relevant veterinary history available to the veterinary surgeon and trainer in order to complete the form accurately. Now, we saw this second career assessment as a way of ensuring that the horse that retires is fit enough to be passed on to a second home, to enter another career, whether it be show jumping, dressage, etc. Of course, the last thing we need is for a horse to find a second home, and then for the horse to have certain vices or unsoundness issues, which would result in the horse going on to a second, third, or even fourth home, which is where we often find the problems that we face. And this assessment form comes at a fee. The vets do charge for an assessment. It's not an in-depth examination of the horse, it's an inspection that is provided by the attending veterinary surgeon. And this information is made available to the chief executive within 1 week of the horse retiring from racing. And should the assessment recommend humane euthanasia and the owner elects not to humanely euthanize the horse, then the owner shall remain responsible for that horse's welfare for the rest of its natural life. Importantly, the owner shall be guilty of an offense if he fails to dispose of a horse in accordance with Rule 41.10 and its sub-rules. 41.10, in a nutshell, absolves the owner from responsibility for a horse if he has that form filled out and it's submitted to the National Horse Racing Authority. And we saw that as an opportunity to ensure that that horse is sound enough to go into a second career. And there are a number of options available for the owner of a horse once a horse ends its racing career. And we outlined that the points that I've raised were important to provide some opportunity to the owners following a horse retiring. And there are options that are afforded to them. Of course, euthanasia is never an easy decision, and that's been spoken about already. But the promulgation of the rule has afforded the opportunity to the owners to have these choices, which is important to tighten the net and to ensure that horses do have a decent chance to get into a second career. And if not, then at least to have the respect of an outcome of human euthanasia, not to end up in a terrible home, which of course can cause great damage to the industry, and of course would be totally unfair to the animal that provides us with our wonderful industry, the horse. I'm now going to pass over the microphone to Hazel Kayiya, who will complete the second half of this presentation. I thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Arnold. Helen Thompson once said, "In riding a horse, we borrow freedom." Before I actually go into the challenges that we actually face when it comes to retirement and aftercare, I wanted to share a story with you. About a couple of years ago, I had the privilege of attending the South African Riding for the Disabled Association, and we had a CSI event there. And one of the things that this organization does is they provide opportunities for children in wheelchairs to actually be able to experience and ride a horse. This one child was sitting there and smiling gleefully and so much happy. And they actually said, "Oh my gosh, I've never been able to walk, but for the first time when I'm actually seated on a horse, I can actually feel my limbs moving." For me, that really, really touched me. Another kid then actually said to me, "Oh my gosh, we're actually now the same height." That is the power of what the horse actually does in the world outside of racing. There's also an organization called the Equine Center, which is a group of individuals which are passionate about strengthening and educating the special needs and disabled. The Equine Center specializes in assisted programs such as the disabilities of cerebral palsy, autism, ADHD, or ADHD, just to name a few. SADA is there to provide for therapeutic and recreational horse riding for the disabled so that they can benefit in aspects of mental and physical lives and social lives. Their aim is to actually teach people with disabilities on how to ride. In Johannesburg, there's an equine-assisted psychotherapy institute. There's actually a growing field currently in South Africa for this field. There's several more of these institutions. However, they find themselves battling with the care in terms of support and some of the challenges that I'm not going to go through. We've actually aligned our challenges, and some of them are the balance of finding the economic value and welfare, the moral dilemma of euthanasia, the perception of horses being seen as a commodity, the economic climate, private sales and auctions, and lack of education and awareness. And I'm not going to go into each and individual one of those. The balance between economic value and welfare. There are more horses requiring welfare attention than can be accommodated by the horse care units and rehoming in South Africa. That is just truly a fact. Even though you do have a lot of retirement homes that are there, the National Horse Trust, the Costa units that are available, there seems to be quite a number of horses that do not have a place to go, especially, for example, after racing, or some that don't even make it to actually get to the race field. The economic costs of these said facilities are funded by a lot by the voluntary donations from the public service and receive little or limited funding from the government. They find themselves quite difficult to sustain themselves. I've got a friend who does horse riding, and one of the things that Horse Riding Institute does is they try and offer tours to try and to raise awareness as well as an income and donations from people. They try and teach people on how to ride, or they actually trade in to say, can you bring in feed or carrots or something just to raise that. But funding is a very, very important thing that seems to be crippling a lot of the initiatives in South Africa. The moral dilemma of euthanasia. This is a sensitive topic of euthanasia as it lists strong emotions. However, this is a humane option to prevent further suffering for animals that are unsound and cannot be rehomed for suitable retirement. The NHA is currently building capacity with some of the abattoirs in trying to be able to actually trace and find where these horses that actually end up in terms of being to be euthanized. Where at this point that it also allows us to try and improve on our traceability options as they communicate with us and we're able to collect the passports from that end, as well as properly document and record these in our database. The economic climate. I find myself, when I'm wearing my studbook hat, a little bit sore at heart because I understand, especially a lot from our breeders, where they find themselves which are boarding homes with a lot of horses that are just abandoned by the owners due to them unable to actually pay for the unkip. In racing, when I wear my licensing and registration hats, there's a lot of trainers that do approach me and say, Hazel, the owners have just stopped paying their stabling fees. What do we do with these horses? South Africa finds themselves at a very, very difficult time. We've got load shedding, the rising cost of goods, unemployment is sitting at an all-time high, 30%. People are unable to actually find the money to be able to pay and service their debts, and therefore the horse seems to be now the one that is the victim. Furthermore, many horses are considered as a commodity rather than as a living creature. I find myself sometimes when I do attend the sales, for example, the national yearling sales, a lot of what's discussed there is the breeding and the conformation. What happens when those horses don't meet those aspects? What happens if it's that lower horse or the medium to lower horses that does not do well in terms of the sales? What happens then to it? Are people willing to actually invest and put money into it to improve it? We also find ourselves, for example, on mares that are fairly reasonable and they have produced foals, however, they have not done their distinguished marks. What happens to those mares on the breeding farms? So those are some of the challenges and questions that we tend to ask ourselves. We've also got the issue of private sales and auctions in South Africa, whereby, in terms of traceability, a lot of the horses that get sold, they sometimes go into their second careers, and there seems to be a lack of communication between us and the sales auctions houses that we are unable to actually trace past that to say, where are the thoroughbred horses going to? In South Africa, we recognize that these are not registered with us, and therefore it becomes actually quite difficult for us. We recognize there's a definite market for horses to enter the informal racing sector. There's no regulation to ensure that movement and ownership changes are recorded post-initial retirement. We've also got an industry currently in South Africa called the rural racing, which is quite booming, where we see a lot of our thoroughbred horses moving into this sector, which is unregulated. This then also becomes quite difficult for us when we like to try and look into measures in terms of equine welfare as well as traceability. There's also been a lack of education and awareness pertaining to the requirements of the retirement of horses. We, as the racing authority, acknowledge that to a certain extent we are also to blame. However, also the trainers and the breeders also need to come to the party, and anyone who's actually responsible for an equine in their care. The problem often occurs not in the first destination, but also that actually happens in the second, third, or fourth retirement homes. The future. Currently, we find ourselves that for the first time in South Africa, we've had different stakeholders coming into the party to wanting to be able to contribute and say we've got a problem when it comes to equine welfare, as well as retirement after the racing career. We're quite fortunate that, for example, it's been announced that one of our stakeholders in the industry was able to actually contribute about 2.2 million in terms of the aftercare to the National Horse Trust. However, that is just one individual, one group of people that are coming through to put money. It is the responsibility for everybody in the industry, regardless of whether you're in thoroughbred racing or not, to actually come through and assist. We are hoping that these meetings will actually become progressive, and we might be able to report at the next IFAR meeting a lot of the strategies that we are currently planning to have implemented. The NHA also recognizes that more can be done regarding traceability. Currently, the NHA is drafting rules to bring auction houses under the rules of racing to introduce measures for notification of private sales. We are also looking at using technology to identify and simplify the channels of notification. I think Simon did mention that there is a problem of changing of ownership, which is something that's also a problem for us currently in South Africa that we need to actually tighten up on. We also acknowledge that there is a need to inform new owners of the financial obligations regarding the horse ownership from the point of sale to the end of their racing career. We find ourselves that it's easy to convince somebody to buy a horse, and yet we're not responsible enough to actually inform them of the different costs that take place. We are quick to say there's going to be stabling fees or boarding fees if it's going to breeding, but rarely do we have a discussion when it comes to the retirement of that horse past its career. And I think it's very, very important that these discussions are held constantly to make people aware of what it entails of actually being responsible for an equine horse. We also understand that there's a need from the NHA to have more roadshows concerning the rules of racing, with specific reference to the Rule 41.10 that Arnold has pointed out. And these should be conducted to highlight and enforce the traceability and aftercare of responsibilities, aftercare requirements. I had a discussion earlier on today with some of the breeders, and some of the questions that I have asked them is, what happens to the horse? What is your responsibility as a breeder, or what is your responsibility as a trainer or an owner once you pass over and you sell that horse to somebody else? A lot of the questions that have come, a lot of the answers that have been given is, well, it's no longer my responsibility. I certainly don't believe in that. I think every single one of us who's in the industry, regardless of whether this horse has passed your hand or not, you've got the right to follow up and make sure that horse is fine. The horse has no voice. It is our moral obligation to protect them. Thank you.
And thank you to Arnold and Hazel again for that informative illustration of aftercare and the challenges that are clearly in place here in South Africa.